They said order was divine, that chaos was sin, and that every human breath in medieval Europe came with a rule attached. Rules about what you could eat, how long you could laugh, when you could sleep, and which direction your corpse should face when it was lowered into the ground. Each decree, each parchment law seemed absurd until you understood what people were truly afraid of. Not the king, not the church, but the world itself. 1. The law of the noisy shoes in 13th century London. The city council banned women from wearing shoes with iron heels that clicked against the cobblestones. The problem wasn't noise. It was sin. The clicking echoed through narrow alleys like a metronome of temptation. Men complained to priests that every tap outside their window stirred unholy thoughts. The council's solution: silence the heels, silence the devil. Women caught defying the rule could be fined or publicly shamed. The strange part is why this mattered. London was drowning in sound. Vendors shouting, pigs screaming, bells tolling. But human rhythm was considered dangerous. A steady beat reminded people of dancing, and dancing reminded them of bodies. And in a world still haunted by plague and famine, bodies were the source of both life and corruption. 2. The rule of the single bath. A good Christian, according to some 12th century clerics, bathed only once a year, preferably at Easter. Anything more frequent risked vanity, pride, or worse, vulnerability. To bathe meant to be naked, and to be naked meant to invite the devil's curiosity. So they issued rules, not laws of kings, but laws of souls. Monks were told to wash only their hands and feet unless illness demanded more. Nuns were warned to bathe in groups, never alone. And peasants, they bathed when the river thawed and God looked away. Yet beneath this madness lay logic. Water wasn't clean, it was death. Streams were filled with waste, and bathhouses often doubled as brothels. To bathe too often was to risk both sin and sickness, so the church's rule, wash your soul, not your body, may have saved more lives than it ruined. 3. The forbidden beard of clergy. In the 11th century, a curious decree came from Rome. Priests were to shave their beards. Why? Because a beard implied wildness, an untamed heart. In an age where every gesture carried meaning, smooth cheeks signified purity. Roughness belonged to knights and sinners. It was also practical. Lice loved holy men as much as anyone else, and monasteries were breeding grounds for everything except modesty. So shaving became salvation. Not just a symbol, but a sanitary measure wrapped in scripture. Some priests rebelled. The Archbishop of Rouen even called the rule an assault on God's own design. But by the next century, the clean, shaven look had won. Ironically, when plague returned, doctors revived the beard. Hidden under the beaked mask of the plague doctor, stuffed with herbs meant to purify the air. 4. The rule of bread thickness. In medieval England, bakers faced one of the strangest economic regulations in history, the size of bread. Every loaf had to weigh exactly as much as the king's inspectors decreed. The right price of bread. Sell a loaf too light, and you could lose your bakery, or your hand. The rule sounds tyrannical, but it was born from famine. Grain shortages could spark riots faster than heresy. By forcing bakers to sell fair loaves, the crown kept peace and profit. Inspectors carried scales like executioners carried axes. They called them bread weights. But everyone knew what they measured was loyalty. 5. The night curfew bell. When the curfew bell rang, fires were to be extinguished, candles snuffed, doors barred. The word curfew comes from the French couvre, feu, cover the fire. To disobey was not rebellion. It was suicide. Thatched roofs and open flames were a city's greatest enemies. In Winchester, England, the bell still rings at 9 every night, an echo of a rule that once separated survival from disaster. For every home that burned in defiance, 10 neighbors paid the price. And so, a rule that began as safety became ritual, a nightly reminder that order was the only thing standing between people and ash. 6. The law against eating too early in monasteries. Timing was sacred. Bells told you when to wake, when to pray, when to suffer quietly. Eating before the appointed hour was gluttony, a sin of the flesh. But the reason wasn't just moral, it was metabolic. Food was scarce. To eat early meant to eat twice, and that threatened the entire community's supply. So monks wrote rules: no eating until after Mass, no meat on Fridays, no laughter at the table. They ate in silence, facing one direction, while a brother read scripture aloud. Meals were not for pleasure, they were for humility. But humility doesn't fill a stomach. Records show secret snacks hidden in cloaks, cheese traded for wine under candlelight. Even holiness needs calories. 7. The forbidden colors of the poor. In 14th century Florence, cloth was law. Sumptuary codes dictated what colors each class could wear. Purple belonged to princes, crimson to cardinals, black velvet to the dead. If a merchant's daughter dared to wear blue silk, a color of the Virgin herself, she could be fined a year's wages. It seems cruel, but it kept the peace. Fashion was status, and status was order. When famine and plague blurred those lines, clothing laws reminded people who they were, or who they weren't. Behind every forbidden dye was an economic truth: pigments were power. The richer the hue, the rarer the source. Ground insects imported minerals, crushed lapis from Afghanistan. So the law wasn't about morality, it was about monopoly. 8. The rule of the right hand. To eat with your left hand in medieval Europe was to confess, without words, that you were unclean. The left hand was for the privy, the right for the plate. And though the Church never canonized this rule, society enforced it with zeal. In banquets, nobles watched one another like hawks. 10. The rule of silence at night, not just the rule of quiet that governed the convent, but true silence. After compline, the final prayer of the day, no word was to be spoken until dawn. Speech after sunset belonged to demons. Monks who broke the silence could be made to lie eye-face down in the cloister, punished not for what they said, but for what they might have said. The logic was simple: noise attracted attention, and attention attracted danger. In the dark, without candles, a monastery was a fortress of shadows. A whispered name could sound like a ghost. Silence was survival. 11. The law of the forbidden clock. For centuries, mechanical clocks were banned in some monasteries. The abbot decided time. No gear or bell could overrule him. When the first water-powered clocks appeared, they were called proud inventions. Only God may measure the hours, wrote one abbot. But soon the clocks were everywhere, and with them came precision. Terrifying precision. You could now measure prayer, labor, punishment. The rule against timekeeping was less about faith and more about fear that men would begin to worship the minute instead of the miracle. 12. The rule of the clean death. A corpse, by medieval law, was property. Not of the family, but of the church. Graveyards were sacred zones, guarded like fortresses of bone. No burial without tithe, no coffin without blessing, and always facing east, toward Jerusalem, where resurrection would begin. Grave diggers followed rules more exact than soldiers. If a body was found facing west, it was turned. If the hands were crossed wrongly, they were reset. Even death had a dress code. The reason, though, was tender people feared being lost. In a world where maps were faith and heaven had coordinates, orientation meant salvation. East was home. The deeper you go, the clearer the pattern becomes. Every strange medieval law, every absurd restriction, was a survival instinct disguised as morality. Noisy shoes led to sin, so they banned rhythm. Baths spread disease, so they called cleanliness pride. Luxury caused envy, so they outlawed color. Logic dressed in superstition, reason wearing a robe. By dawn, when the curfew bell stopped echoing, people would wake to another day of rules. And each rule whispered the same quiet promise: obey, and you might live to hear tomorrow's bell. The air at sunrise carried the sound of obedience. The creak of shutters opening only after the church bells allowed it, the shuffle of boots avoiding the forbidden corners of the market where heretics once stood. The city breathed in rhythm, every motion wrapped in ritual. And still, more rules waited. 13. The rule of the window tax in some towns, light itself became a luxury. When plague and war thinned the treasury, lords sought new ways to squeeze coins from the living. They decided to tax the sky. Every window larger than a man's head carried a fee. Too many windows, and the lord's men would brick them up. A punishment that still scars ancient houses with rows of blind, empty arches. They claimed it discouraged vanity, that large windows tempted thieves. But the truth was simpler. People had begun building upward, stacking families like books, and light was wealth. If you could afford the sun, you could afford the tax. So towns dimmed, and candles replaced daylight. For generations, people grew used to the half-dark, and the world, once open, narrowed to a flicker. 14. The rule of the pig trial. There was a time when justice extended beyond mankind. If a pig trampled a child, it was not slaughtered quietly. It was tried. Witnesses testified. Priests recited oaths. A lawyer stood beside the animal, pretending to plead its case. To modern eyes, it was madness. But to medieval hearts, it was fairness. If sin had infected all creation, then even beasts could err and be punished. The rule wasn't cruelty. It was reassurance. In a world where children died for no reason, people needed cause and consequence. The law gave it to them, even if that meant sentencing a pig to hang. 15. The rule of the bell rope in cemeteries. Ropes hung from fresh graves, threading up through the soil to a small bell above. It wasn't a decoration. It was a lifeline. People feared being buried alive more than death itself, so the safety coffin became law in parts of 17th century Europe. A person too quiet to move might still find the strength to ring for salvation. The gravedigger's job didn't end at burial. He had to listen through the night for bells that tolled without wind. No one recorded how many were truly saved. But the practice stayed long after plague years ended. It was cheaper to listen for ghosts than to bury the living twice. 16. The rule of the forbidden nightshade. Not all medieval rules were written by kings. Some were whispered between midwives. Nightshade, they said, was the devil's herb, a plant that grew only where blood had touched the earth. Anyone caught brewing it risked accusation of witchcraft, and yet physicians secretly used it. Belladonna dulled pain, slowed bleeding, calmed fever. The ban protected the healers as much as their patients. Because when medicine looked like magic, one failed cure could end with a rope. So the rule stood: if you used the devil's herb, do not speak its name. 17. The law of the church door. Weddings, baptisms, even business deals were done at the church threshold, not inside. Because once you stepped beyond the door, you left the world of man and entered the world of God. The doorway was neutral ground, a border between dust and divinity. Merchants swore oaths there, thieves confessed, and lovers pledged their futures with one foot on holy stone and one on dirt. It was both law and symbolism, a reminder that every promise began between two realms, heaven above and earth below. And if you broke that vow, the church door would remember. 18. The rule of the baker's collar in Paris. Bakers once wore heavy iron collars marked with the city's seal. It wasn't punishment, it was privilege. The collar proved they were licensed and watched. During famine, selling bread outside the city's price law could mean death, so the collar became both badge and shackle, ensuring the crowd knew whom to trust and whom to hang when loaves ran short. If a riot began, the baker's collar gleamed in the torchlight, the perfect target for rage. 19. The law of the candle with church candles, market candles, even home tapers were regulated by law. Too thin, and they'd melt too quickly. A cheat. Too thick, and you were wasting wax better sent to God. Inspectors carried brass molds to measure them, stamping fair candles with a seal of approval. Behind the ritual lay a practical terror fire. A crooked candle could burn a chapel to ash. So purity of worship meant purity of wax. 20. The rule of the leper bell. Lepers walked the edges of towns, marked not by... The rule protected the healthy, yes, but it also protected the damned. Without the bell, they risked stones and swords. With it, they became invisible pilgrims, haunting roads between villages, feared but tolerated. In time, the bell grew symbolic, a sound between life and death, mercy and exile. A rule that said, "We will not kill you, but we will never let you forget what you are." 21. The law of the sooted chimney. Medieval cities were black with smoke. But every spring, the guilds demanded chimney inspection. If soot lined your flue, you paid a fine. If it caught fire, you paid with your house. This rule wasn't mere cleanliness. Soot was wealth, an indicator of how much fuel you could afford to burn. Poor homes were clean because they were cold. Rich homes, black with luxury. The law tried to erase that difference, or at least hide it behind fresh plaster. 22. The rule of the silent barber. In some monasteries, barbers were forbidden to speak while cutting a monk's hair. Silence was discipline, they said, a moment for reflection. But beneath that stillness lurked superstition. Words could carry spirits. A sudden phrase, a name spoken while the blade moved, might let a demon slip inside through the wound. So the razor moved in quiet arcs, scraping faith into skin. Hair fell like black snow, and no one dared breathe a syllable until the tonsure was done. 23. The law of the holy relic weight. When relics, bones of saints, shreds of cloth, drops of supposed blood, were displayed, priests weighed them in public. A lighter relic was a sign of falsehood. If it grew heavier over years, pilgrims rejoiced. The saint was accepting their prayers. The weighing became rule, not faith, an early form of auditing the divine. Too many miracles meant suspicion. Too few meant poverty, so the balance had to stay believable. Heaven, it turned out, needed bookkeeping. 24. The rule of the candle at birth. Midwives were ordered to keep a candle burning during childbirth, not for light, but for defense. They believed demons waited near the womb to claim the infant's first breath. A steady flame was a sword of light, a ward against shadows. If the candle guttered, panic followed. Prayers were whispered, charms tied to the mother's wrist. The child's first cry wasn't joy, it was proof that the soul had escaped the dark intact. Every candle, in its small circle of glow, was both law and lullaby. 25. The law of the cursed well. When wells ran dry, villagers blamed witchcraft. So came the rule, no woman may draw water at night. If someone was seen lowering a bucket after dark, she risked being accused of poisoning the source. The fear was practical. Night drawing led to theft, people stealing from communal reserves. But the punishment was mythic, a witch's dunking or exile. Rules preserved water, but also hierarchy. It kept the poor thirsty and the powerful pure. And so, by the time the next curfew bell rang, the day had already folded back into obedience. People barred their doors, checked their chimneys, counted their candles, whispered their prayers. Every rule, from the weight of bread to the silence of scissors, held the same fragile logic. Survival required submission. In a world that felt like it was ending every decade, by plague, by famine, by faith, rules were the only thing left to believe in. The bells tolled again, and the city sank into hush. Tomorrow, new decrees would come, and every man, woman, and child would rise once more, not to freedom, but to the strange comfort of knowing exactly what they could and could not do. 26. The rule of the empty chair in medieval taverns. Every hearth kept one chair unoccupied. The angel's seat. It wasn't kindness, it was insurance. If a traveler filled it uninvited, the innkeeper would whisper, "You've stolen a spirit's rest." And the night would grow uneasy. The rule came from famine years, when strangers often arrived at inns already dying. They would sit, eat little, pay less, and die by morning. So the empty chair became law. Leave a space for the unseen guest, or risk inviting death into your own seat. Even centuries later, chroniclers wrote of landlords fined for neglecting the ritual. Because once an inn lost its angel, it lost its luck. 27. The law of the candle at execution. When the condemned walked to the scaffold, a monk carried a single candle before them, not for mercy, but for measurement. If the flame survived the journey unbroken, their soul was considered saved. If it went out, the hangman quickened his step, no sense delaying a spirit already claimed. Spectators watched the light as eagerly as they watched the rope, and when it flickered, they crossed themselves. The candle was rule, not theatre. A thin, trembling contract between faith and fear. Only in later centuries did the custom fade, when death itself became too common to sanctify. 28. The rule of the salt line. Salt was life, and life needed boundaries. So peasants drew lines of salt across thresholds, windowsills, and even cradles. At first, it was pagan, a charm against spirits. But the church, unable to kill the habit, baptized it instead. Blessed salt. They called it, and the superstition became sacrament. Every village had its rule book of grains. How much salt per wound, per wedding, per burial? Drop too little, and the soul wandered. Drop too much, and you tempted greed. Even kings kept salt in their coffers, more guarded than gold. For in a world without refrigeration, the line between hunger and holiness was measured in handfuls. 29. The rule of the candle in the window. When plague swept a street, neighbors left candles burning in their windows. Not as warning, but invitation. If someone inside still lived, the flame meant hope. If it guttered out, no one entered again. Cities enforced the rule by decree. At dusk, patrolmen would walk the alleys, counting lights. A dark house meant another tally for the dead wagon. A lit one meant faith or denial. By morning, smoke told the truth. 30. The law of the whispered confession before formal confession boxes. Repentance was public. A sinner knelt before the altar, naming their sins aloud. But scandal spread faster than forgiveness, so bishops introduced a rule confessions must be whispered. The priest leaned close, ear nearly touching lips, and words that might have damned the speaker. At night, Every noble household kept a candle burning at the foot of the bed. Not for reading, for protection. They said the flames smoke confused evil spirits. That darkness unbroken invited nightmares too real to be dreams. Servants risked lashes if they forgot to light it. The irony was cruel. Half the houses that burned began with that one faithful candle, and still no one dared sleep without it. 37. The rule of the hidden name. To tell a stranger your full name was folly. Names carried power, and to speak one completely was to hand over part of your soul. So, nicknames and saint names became law in conversation. Merchants signed contracts with initials. Pilgrims used only their birthplace. Even kings signed charters with titles instead of names. Rex Anglorum, Dux Normania. It was anonymity wrapped in majesty. And in a world where curses felt as real as coronations, silence was self-defense. 38. The law of the crossing spoon. When two spoons crossed during a meal, diners froze. The one whose spoon lay beneath would die first, said the superstition. So the rule was born, never let cutlery touch. It sounds absurd, but it taught care. Gentleness in movement, precision at table, etiquette as survival. In plague times, when touch spread death, even manners became medicine. 39. The rule of the wandering priest. A priest who left his parish without permission could be branded. Vegas. A wanderer, a soul without flock. They were hunted, fined, sometimes mutilated. Because a priest outside his boundary was chaos, he could bless or damn without oversight. But some broke the rule to carry last rites to dying villages. The church called them rebels, the people called them saints. By nightfall, the list of forbidden acts grew longer than the prayers meant to absolve them. And yet, these laws, bizarre, tender, cruel, all spoke the same language: survival by structure. If the sky was wrath, then order was shelter. If famine stalked the roads, then ritual was food. So they obeyed. They tied salt to windows, whispered names, counted spoons, lit candles that killed them, and called it faith. Because in a world so fragile, the rules, no matter how strange, were the only thing that ever made sense. Yet rules have a way of multiplying. A law to protect becomes a law to control, and a law to control becomes a weapon. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had so many decrees that life itself felt like a courtroom, and God, the eternal judge, presided over every breath. 40. The rule of the walking distance. On Sundays, the faithful could walk only as far as the Sabbath mile. Anything more was work, and work on the Lord's day meant sin. So every village marked its invisible border with stones or small crosses. Step beyond, and you risked your soul. The rule served purpose. It kept people near the church, safe from highway robbers, sermons fresh in mind. But it also turned faith into geography. To pray was to measure distance, and every road past the stone whispered temptation. 41. The law of the locked Bible. The church guarded its words like treasure. Bibles were chained to lecterns, bound in iron, accessible only through priests. It wasn't tyranny at first. Parchment was rare, ink dear, literacy rarer still. But as whispers of reform spread, the locks tightened. The law of the locked Bible became a symbol knowledge with a key. Peasants were told, too much scripture blinds the humble. Perhaps it did, because when the chains finally broke and the words spilled into the hands of the people, Europe set itself on fire. 42. The rule of the unseen healer. Women who healed too well were punished. Midwives who saved too many births, herbalists who cured what doctors could not. They attracted suspicion like flies to honey. So a new rule emerged, silent but sharp: never take credit for a miracle. To heal was divine, but to seem divine was heresy. And so, Hundreds of women vanished into the smoke of accusation, not for witchcraft, but for competence. A cruel irony that the best healers obeyed this rule by forgetting their own names. 43. The law of the bound corpse. When plague struck, fear made monsters of men to stop the dead from rising. Bodies were sometimes tied at wrists and ankles before burial. The cords weren't superstition alone. Grave robbers had begun stealing fresh corpses for study. The new science hungered for anatomy. The rule blurred mercy and horror. Tie the dead, not because they might walk, but because the living might steal them. It was protection disguised as paranoia. And in the end, both proved justified. 44. The rule of the burned bridge in villages hit by pestilence. Bridges were destroyed to seal the infection in. Whole towns became islands of silence. The healthy who fled were branded cowards. The ones who stayed were martyrs. So the rule was written no crossing until the third moon after the last death. It sounds monstrous, but it was medicine in an age without doctors. The bridge was not just wood. It was the border between hope and contagion. 45. The rule of the king's touch scrofula, the king's evil, was said to be cured by royal hands. So laws arose requiring monarchs to perform public healing ceremonies. Peasants lined for hours, coughing, trembling, kneeling as the king laid fingers on their sores. The ritual mixed politics and mysticism, turning faith into propaganda. Kings cured few, but convinced many, and that belief, that obedience could heal, lasted longer than any medicine they had. 46. The law of the forbidden dream in monastic dormitories. A monk who spoke of his dreams risked punishment. Dreams were considered doors to temptation, or worse, prophecy without permission. To dream was human, to interpret it was divine business. Yet the rule was impossible to keep. Dreams spilled like ink. Some monks recorded them in secret, calling them visions. And centuries later, those hidden journals, during eclipses, villages sealed their windows and covered wells. They believed the moon drew sickness from earth like a tide. When it darkened, all that poison fell back down. So they waited in silence, listening to dogs bark at the invisible sky. Then, when the light returned, people cheered, not at astronomy, but survival. They had followed the rule. The world was restored. 49. The law of the travelers bred pilgrims were required to carry holy bread from their parish whenever they left home. Not for eating, but for proof. If found without it, they were treated as vagrants or spies. It was less about piety than population control. The bread marked where you belonged, your village, stamped into its crust like a passport. Break it, and your past broke with it. In an era without borders, a loaf could be your identity. 50. The rule of the silent harvest during certain holy weeks. No song or laughter was allowed in the fields. The church feared that joy might insult the saints who blessed the crops. So peasants swung scythes in silence, reaping grain to the rhythm of fear. But when dusk fell, they gathered in barns, closed the doors, and sang in whispers anyway. Because obedience feeds the body, but rebellion feeds the soul. By the 15th century, Europe was suffocating under its own commandments. The more uncertain the world became, the tighter people clung to ritual. Every rule promised safety, every punishment promised meaning. And in a time when reason was still a rumor, meaning was the only medicine left. But something began to crack. Merchants crossed forbidden borders and found they didn't die. Healers experimented with banned herbs and cured the incurable. Astronomers looked at the heavens, once the church's private ceiling, and realized the stars moved by no man's decree. The age of rule was fading. not dying, but transforming, the old faith melting into law books, science, and custom. What once was holy became habit, what once was superstition became society. The world didn't lose its rules. It only stopped asking who wrote them. And as dawn came again, bells rang not for curfew, but for commerce. Windows unbricked, candles thinned, bridges rebuilt. The laws remained, fossilized in etiquette and bureaucracy, the ghosts of commandments we no longer understand. Somewhere, an inn still keeps an empty chair. Somewhere, a widow still covers her mirror. And somewhere, a candle still burns at a bedfoot. Not for light, not for safety, but for the ancient comfort of following a rule that no one remembers for reasons no one needs to. And still, even as centuries passed, and plague became memory instead of fear, somewhere in the quiet corners of Europe, the old rules refused to die. They hid not in parchment or proclamation, but in gestures the sign of the cross before a journey, a pinch of salt over the shoulder, the hush that falls in a church even when no one believes anymore. Because rules outlive their reasons. And in that afterlife, they become something gentler: habit, tradition, comfort. 51. The rule of the covered mouth. When people began sneezing in public after the Black Death, elders taught children to cover their mouths, not out of courtesy, but fear. Breath carried the invisible. Centuries later, it became politeness. What was once survival turned into manners. Every cough in a tavern was an echo of the plague years, and every folded handkerchief a quiet memorial to those who'd never learned the trick in time. 52. The law of the quiet step. Medieval nuns walked in silence, not only to respect their vows, but to feel the ground, to listen for the hollow echo of weakness in the stone beneath. Cloisters cracked, tunnels formed. The quiet step saved lives as surely as prayer. Now we teach children to walk softly in libraries. Different walls, same echo. 53. The rule of the clock tower. The first mechanical clocks didn't just mark time, they replaced the divine. Monks used to decide the hours by candle burn or bell shadow. But when towns installed iron clocks, their ticking became the new prayer. No one meant it as rebellion, but it was. The rule of time replaced the rule of faith, and though the church fought it, the people obeyed the sound that never slept. You still hear it now, in every city, that ancient law of the minute hand, dictating when to rise, when to work, when to rest. A rule so old we forgot to question it. 54. The rule of the doorstep blessing. Every threshold once had a blessing scratched into it, 3 crosses, or a symbol of a fish. And no home was safe without it, and when travelers left, they touched the mark twice. Once for luck, once for goodbye. Now, we call it locking the door. Same motion, different faith. 55. The law of the holy fire. Every Easter, flames were carried from the church to relight the city's hearths. One sacred spark distributed like grace. To burn any other fire that night was outlawed. The church's flame was the year's first sunrise, and it marked who belonged. Today, we call it New Year's fireworks. Noise instead of light, joy instead of fear. But the longing is the same. The wish to reset the world, if only for a night. 56. The rule of the final bread. When a family member lay dying, a small loaf was baked and placed by the bed. The last person to touch it after the death would eat it, to keep the spirit from wandering. If no one dared, the dog was fed. A loyal guardian in both life and death. You can still find traces of this ritual in country wakes, where food and sorrow still share the same table. 57. The law of the bell at sea. When sailors died far from land, captains ordered the ship's bell rung once for each soul lost. Land dwellers heard it as superstition. Sailors called it law, because the sea had no grave markers, only sound. To this day, in harbors across the world, bells still toll for ships that never return. The rule survived every empire, because some laws are too human to end. 58. The rule of the quiet meal. In certain monasteries, eating in silence wasn't punishment. It was gratitude. Each chew counted as prayer, each swallow a verse. Speech was forbidden not because it was sinful, but because it might drown out the simple miracle of being alive. Now we eat in front of screens, and silence feels awkward. But sometimes, when the noise fades, that old law whispers through the quiet, remember the taste of your own life. 59. The rule of the second candle. Long after superstition died, widows kept a secret rule. When lighting a candle for the dead, always light two. One for the body, one for what lingers. If the second burned faster, the soul had moved on. If not, someone prayed harder. Even today, in corners of old cathedrals, two flames still tremble side by side. A superstition turned devotion, a rule turned love. 60. The law of the forgotten word. Some words were banned not because they were vulgar, but because they were sacred. You couldn't speak the name of God in vain, nor the name of the devil at all. Over time, language grew polite, then forgetful. Curses became softened ghosts of holy fear. Heck, darn, gosh, every syllable a fossil of faith, still carrying the faint scent of heaven or hell. So many rules have fallen away, yet none have truly vanished. The world we live in, our laws, our manners, our tiny daily rituals, is just the Middle Ages translated. We wash our hands not from fear of sin, but of germs. We cover our mouths not from modesty, but hygiene. We whisper in sacred places not for salvation, but because we still feel something enormous, and we don't know what to call it anymore. If you listen closely, beneath the hum of traffic, the tick of the clock, the rustle of paper laws, you can still hear it, the echo of the old world. The sound of bells ringing across a sleeping city, reminding its people of the same quiet truth that ruled them 1,000 years ago. That obedience, however foolish, was never really about control. It was about hope. Because in the dark, before the dawn, when fear still ruled and silence still prayed, every man, woman, and child believed the same fragile thing, that if they followed the rules, the sun would rise again. And somehow, it always did. It rose over cities scarred by fire and famine, over villages where bells rang to warn of plague, and over monasteries where monks still whispered forbidden dreams. It shone through the cracks of shuttered windows, across ink, stained ledgers, and crumbling parchment laws, as if daylight itself refused to obey the decrees of man. But humanity could never stop writing new ones. For every superstition buried, another took its place. Because rules, strange, comforting, or cruel, were never about control alone. They were our attempt to bargain with chaos. And chaos, patient and amused, always listened. 61. The rule of the pilgrim stone. Even after faith fractured into countless sects, travelers still carried small stones from their home churches. Not relics, not idols, just something from home. When they reached a foreign shrine, they left the stone behind and took a new one. One stone for another. A quiet exchange between the known and the unknown. Centuries later, tourists picked up the habit again, collecting pebbles, seashells, tokens. The medieval rule had evolved into something gentler, a way of saying I was here and I remember. Every stone a passport stamped by the earth. 62. The law of the unseen guest in manor houses. An extra plate was always set at the table. Sometimes for Christ, sometimes for a spirit sometimes for luck. The rule was that no meal was ever complete without the possibility of interruption. The superstition faded, but hospitality survived. We still pour an extra cup of tea, still leave lights on for those returning late. Traces of a world that feared being caught unprepared when grace decided to visit. 63. The rule of the forbidden fire. When lightning struck a church steeple, villagers rushed not with buckets, but with relics. They held up bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, whispered prayers meant to calm the sky. It rarely worked, but it gave them courage. And courage, then as now, was half of survival. The church later outlawed such acts, calling them pagan echoes, yet people still kept relics near their hearths. Even today, families hang icons, medals, photos, modern relics to ward off the same ancient fear that the heavens might notice us. 64. The law of the quiet bell. When a monastery lost too many brothers to plague, the last survivor would silence the bells. Not forever, just until new voices arrived. A community without sound was considered dead, but a bell rung by one man was worse. It meant despair. The rule said, better silence than loneliness. And though the monasteries are gone, the logic remains. We still equate noise with life. Cities that fall silent feel haunted. A quiet phone, an empty inbox, a wordless house, the new monasteries of modern fear. 65. The rule of the mirrorless room, even in the age of glass. Some old families refused to hang mirrors in bedrooms. They said reflections trap dreams, and that the soul, wandering in sleep, might not find its way back if startled by its own face. Science explained it away. But insomnia still haunts us, and we still cover our eyes before we wake, as if afraid to see who we've become in the night. 66. The rule of the unbroken circle. In medieval feasts, diners sat in circles, never rectangles, so that no one sat at the end. Equality was illusion, but geometry was diplomacy. If no man sat at the head, no man could be blamed when the food ran out. The custom faded, yet the round table lingered. From King Arthur's legend to the modern conference room, the same shape remains, a quiet symbol of fairness. 67. The rule of the hearth blessing. When a new house was built, villagers placed bread and salt in the fireplace before the first fire. Bread for nourishment, salt for preservation, and ashes from an older home to remind the new one how to survive the winter. The law demanded it not as faith, but as insurance. A superstition cheaper than rebuilding after a fire, and in that small act, breaking bread with ghosts, people found comfort. Today we call it a housewarming gift. We bring wine, candles, or flowers. Different objects, same instinct, carry warmth into the unknown. 68. The law of the unlaced boot in medieval courts. When a servant entered a lord's room uninvited, he was required to loosen one boot. A sign of apology, a symbol of disarmament. It made it impossible to run, impossible to fight. No one remembers this rule now, but we still take off our shoes at the door, a modern peace offering born of ancient fear. 69. The rule of the listening night in some villages. No one spoke after midnight unless spoken to first. It was said that after the 12th bell, voices carried too far, that they might reach the ears of the dead. So people learned to whisper. Children grew up afraid of hearing their own names answered from the dark. Now, we call it superstition. But every time we lower our voices in the dark, every time we check behind us when the world feels too still, we obey the same old rule, the night listens. 70. The rule of the honest shadow pilgrims once swore oaths not on relics, but on their shadows. They'd say, "If I lie, may the sun refuse to follow me." The ritual faded, but the metaphor survived. Even now, when we speak of conscience, we talk about what follows us, what haunts us, what dark shape we can never quite leave behind. The centuries rolled onward. The ink faded, the laws dissolved, but the rhythm of obedience endured. Because the rules were never just about survival. They were a way to remember what survival cost. Every time we buckle a seatbelt, say, "Bless you," after a sneeze, check the lock twice, or knock on wood before speaking of fortune. We are not rational. We are ancient. We are repeating the same quiet magic that carried us through plague, famine, and fear, the belief that small gestures can keep the world from falling apart. And maybe that's the real secret buried beneath 1,000 strange medieval laws. That behind every absurdity, behind the pig on trial, the candle at the bedfoot, the forbidden dance, the empty chair, there was always one soft, unspoken truth. They were trying to be good, to make sense of pain, to build a pattern strong enough to hold back the night. So when the sun rose each morning, when the bells rang, and when the city stirred under the same sky that had terrified its ancestors, no one realized they were living inside the ruins of their own faith. A faith made not of miracles, but of manners. The world had outgrown the plague, the superstition, the darkness, but not the need to believe that order was possible. Even now, if you listen closely at dawn, when the light is still grey and the streets are half asleep, you can hear the faint echo of medieval obedience in the air, a kettle whistling like a curfew bell, a door closing softly, a hand hovering over a switch before turning on the light, as if asking permission from the sun. It's not fear anymore, it's habit. And habit, after 1,000 years, becomes history. The medieval world may be gone, but its rules, its strange, sacred, ridiculous rules, still rise with the morning light. Because deep down, we're still the same creatures who believed that if we followed them, if we obeyed the rituals of survival just a little longer, the sun would rise again tomorrow, and the world, however fragile, however foolish, would still be ours to wake up to. ChatGPT, and yet, even that promise was never certain. For every dawn that came, there were nights that refused to end. Winters that lasted years, storms that erased entire coastlines, plagues that silenced the bells they once obeyed. There were mornings when the sun rose red, not with hope, but with warning. And still, they called it a blessing. Because the human heart, like a monastery wall, remembers better than it understands. It keeps the echoes long after the prayers have stopped. 71. The rule of the returning flame. In many towns, after a fire destroyed a home, the ashes were collected and kept in a clay jar near the new hearth. The rule said, never begin again with nothing. Carry a piece of what burned, so that what comes next knows what it replaced. Now, when disaster strikes, a city rebuilt, a house restored, we do the same without realizing. We keep the rubble, the photographs, the broken key. Reminders that loss, too, has its ritual. 72. The rule of the covered threshold in plague years. Families covered their thresholds with black cloth. A warning to passers-by. Do not enter. Grief lives here. When the morning ended, the cloth was burned at dawn, and the smoke was said to carry the souls upward. Today, we hang wreaths, tie ribbons, wear black for a week. The fabric remains, the meaning shifts. But the law, to make grief visible, so the world knows to tread softly, endures. 73. The law of the kept candle, a single candle, saved from a funeral mass, was stored for years. If sickness returned, the candle was lit again, the same flame to ward off the same darkness. It was, in a sense, the first form of vaccination a light meant to remember death and keep it away. Centuries later, we inject memory into our veins instead of wax. The science changed. The ritual didn't. 74. The rule of the last bell, when a monastery finally fell. To war, to plague, to time. The last brother alive was ordered to ring the bell once. A farewell not to the world, but to order itself. No one knows how many times it happened. But the image lingers, a single monk, alone, pulling the rope as dust falls from the rafters, the bells echo mixing with the wind. The final sound of obedience, before silence became holy again. That same echo lives in every empty church today, in every museum whispering its own requiem. 75. The rule of the locked gate. When cities grew walls, they also grew curfews. At sundown, the gates closed, and those left outside were neither citizen nor stranger, only forgotten. The law was survival. A single traveler could carry the plague in his breath. But for those trapped beyond, it was exile. People built huts outside the gates, entire shadow towns of outcasts waiting for morning mercy. We still build walls today, of passports, algorithms, invisible permissions. And though the gates are digital, the fear is the same, that what waits outside will change us. 76. The rule of the empty church. When plague swept a city faster than priests could bury the dead, church doors were left open at night so angels could come and go unhindered. The wind would pass through, rattling pews and candles, and people would wake believing they'd heard wings. The law was small and useless, but it gave the dying comfort, a way to believe heaven still remembered the address. 77. The law of the carved door. Carpenters carved crosses or initials into every door frame they built. The rule: the house must know its maker. If the builder died, the carving became protection, a signature against misfortune. Centuries later, homeowners still write names in wet cement or carve initials into beams no one will see. Not vanity, memory, a silent note to the future that says, someone cared enough to make this. 78. The rule of the quiet reader. Scripture once said, read not aloud unless commanded. Because to speak sacred words without authority was to invite blasphemy. So monks learned to read silently, an innovation that changed the world. Before then, reading meant sound, thought was communal. After, it became private, and from that silence came invention, rebellion, imagination. The first revolution didn't begin with a sword. It began with a whisper that no one else could hear. 79. The rule of the broken hourglass. When someone died, families turned every hourglass upside down and let the sand run out. Time, they said, should stop for the dead. In modern funerals, clocks are often covered, and even in hospitals. When a patient passes, monitors are switched off quietly, as if we're still afraid of time noticing. 80. The law of the two lights. Travelers in the late Middle Ages carried two lanterns, one for the road ahead, and one turned backward. The rear light kept wolves and thieves away, but it also symbolized something deeper, that one should never walk forward without honoring what follows behind. Even now, in cities lit by neon, our cars have headlights and taillights, the same twin beacons of caution and memory. Progress never moves without its shadow. Rules became customs. Customs became habits, and habits became invisible. But the world that once built its safety from superstition still beats beneath ours, like a heart buried under stone. Every law we pass, every sign we follow, every red light we stop at, is an echo of that medieval craving for order. It's not just control, it's comfort. The belief that if we obey the small rules, the big ones, death, chaos, meaning, will obey us in return. And maybe that's why the strange medieval world still feels so familiar. Because we haven't really left it. We've just given it better lighting. So when the next morning comes, when alarms ring instead of church bells, and traffic hums where the curfew once howled, remember this: you are living in the ruins of 1,000 forgotten laws. You are surrounded by the ghosts of rules that once decided who lived and who burned. The world you call rational is built on rituals older than memory, and every one of them was written by hands trembling with the same hope that built the cathedrals. That if they just followed the rules, the sun would rise again, and against all odds, it still does. The sun still rises, but it no longer answers to bells. It rises over cities made of glass instead of stone, over markets that never sleep, over screens that shine brighter than stained glass ever did. And yet, beneath all this light, nothing has really changed. We still fear the dark. We still whisper before we sleep. We still make promises to invisible powers, though we now call them algorithms, statistics, medicine, luck. The Middle Ages never ended. They just learned to hide in modern language. 81. The rule of the screen light long ago. Candles were sacred. Little flames to keep the void away. Now the glow comes from our hands. We fall asleep by blue light, faces lit like saints before their icons. And if you look closely, the posture is the same, head bowed, hands clasped, eyes glazed by faith. It's worship, only colder. Every notification, every message read before bed is a prayer that the world is still there when we wake. 82. The rule of the silent crowd. When a monarch entered a medieval hall, everyone fell silent. Not out of respect, out of terror. One wrong sound could be heard as treason. Centuries later, we call it etiquette. At concerts, in theaters, during moments of national mourning. We still hush ourselves as if royalty has entered the room. We call it reverence, but the bones of fear are still underneath. 83. The rule of the electric bell. The monastery's bell became the factory whistle. The factory whistle became the school bell. Now it's the alarm on your phone. Same rhythm, same obedience, different reasons. Every ring still divides our days, reminding us that time isn't ours. That someone, somewhere, still decides when we begin end. 84. The law of the bright cross in medieval towns. Crosses marked where plague victims died. Now, at highways, white crosses bloom along the roadside, names carved into metal instead of marble. Different century, same instinct, to mark the spot where chaos broke the rule. To remind the living that safety is temporary, and memory is the only law that outlasts the body. 85. The rule of the virtual pilgrimage. Pilgrims once walked for months to reach holy shrines. They slept under bridges, kissed relics, risked bandits and fever. Today, we travel in pixels, virtual tours, online masses, digital memorials. The body stays still, but the heart still wanders. The screen glows like stained glass. The scroll replaces the road. Faith has gone wireless, but not extinct. 86. The rule of the public confession. Medieval sinners confessed before priests. Modern ones confess to the world. Social media has become the new altar, a place where guilt, outrage, repentance, and judgment all live together. The ritual is the same: a sin spoken, a crowd assembled, an absolution begged for or denied. Where once the priest decided your penance, now it's the comments section. Forgiveness outsourced to strangers. 87. The law of the counted step. The monks counted prayers on beads. We count steps on screens. They called it devotion. We call it fitness. Both are the same conversation with mortality, a way to prove to ourselves that we're still moving, still measurable, still alive. 88. The rule of the kept relic once. Relics were bones of saints, feathers of angels, thorns from crowns. Now, they are ticket stubs, photographs, strands of hair. The logic hasn't changed. We hold onto fragments because we fear forgetting. Every museum, every scrapbook, and every archive is just a cathedral of memory. And every relic, sacred or mundane, says the same quiet thing: I was here. Please remember me. 89. The rule of the invisible judge. In the Middle Ages, God watched. Now, the cameras do. The gaze remains holy, omnipresent, unseen, judging. We obey crosswalk signals like commandments. We smile at security lenses like saints before icons. We have replaced divine judgment with digital witness, the fear of sin with the fear of being recorded. But both feel the same in the stomach. 90. The rule of the blessed word. Once, to own a Bible was a privilege. Now, words are everywhere, cheap, infinite, disposable. And yet, every few centuries, one text still changes everything. The script of history never stops writing itself. We still argue over which words are holy, which should be banned, which can be spoken aloud. Language remains the oldest battlefield between freedom and faith. 91. The law of the silent procession. The medieval funeral was a march. Slow, heavy, public. Everyone saw the cost of death. Now we hide it behind tinted windows and quiet corridors. But the need to walk together never vanished. We march for peace, for justice, for memory. Different banners, same yearning to make meaning visible with movement. 92. The rule of the clockless night. There are still places, monasteries, deserts, hospitals, where time folds into prayer, where hours mean nothing. When the electricity fails and the city goes black, we taste it again, that ancient silence. No ticking, no blinking, only breath and heartbeat. That's when the medieval self returns, the creature that feared darkness, but also belonged to it. 93. The rule of the second sunrise. Some medieval monks believed that dawn didn't truly begin until the first human looked at it. The world, they said, was incomplete without witness. And maybe they were right. The sun rises every day. But it only becomes morning when someone notices. The rules we live by are not written on stone or parchment anymore. They're written in what we choose to notice. 94. The rule of the forgotten names. There are more graves than prayers, more ghosts than believers, and yet the dead remain organized, catalogued in archives, stored in servers, etched into marble grids. We still follow the medieval impulse to label what's lost. We still whisper names long after the meaning fades, because forgetting feels like another kind of death and order, even artificial, feels like mercy. 95. The law of the measured shadow. In the 14th century, sundials ruled time. Now, satellites do. But shadows still move, and we still watch them to know where we are. Every skyscraper casts a sundial at noon. A reminder that even progress must obey light. The Middle Ages never ended. They live inside us, in gestures, in instincts, in the quiet laws we obey without thinking. When you close a door softly, so as not to wake the house, when you knock before entering, when you lower your voice in a church, you are performing rituals older than your language. We like to believe we are modern, rational, unbound by superstition. But what is a password if not a spell? What is a law if not a prayer written in bureaucracy? What is civilization if not a monastery that never sleeps? The sun will rise tomorrow. It always does. But the reason we still watch it, the reason we still wait for its warmth before we move, is the same reason our ancestors tied salt to windows and prayed through plague. We need to believe there's a pattern, that there's order in the light and meaning in the rules we follow to survive it. Because in the end, every medieval law, every superstition, every ritual was not about control, it was about continuity. A way to whisper across centuries, we're still here, and as long as the sun keeps rising, as long as someone still waits for it, so are they.